Just a housekeeping point. This meeting is being recorded and we will be posting it on the IFLA Library Building and Equipment section YouTube channel after the event. All three of our speakers have invaluable knowledge and experience of responding when disaster strikes. And I think the things that you will see and hear will provoke reflection and questions. So we've therefore allocated a good amount of time after the presentations to allow for discussion. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat and Ben is going to be monitoring them as they come in. So I'd now like to welcome our first speaker, Malia van Heukelem, who is the Art Archivist Librarian at the University of Hawaii Manoa Library and has volunteered as the National Heritage Responder for the American Institute of Conservation since 2011. She will be speaking to us about her experiences during the initial response and ongoing recovery in the aftermath of the wind-driven wildfires that devastated the community of Lāhainā in 2023. Malia.
Thank you, Linda. Will somebody else be queuing up the video or am I sharing the video?
Candy?
Thank you. Aloha, my name is Malia van Heukelem and I'm the Art Archivist Librarian at the University of Hawaii at Manoa Library. I'm also a volunteer National Heritage Responder. Myself and a colleague, Leanne Na'awau, have been supporting the Maui wildfire recovery since August of 2023. The fires were the most disastrous in our state's history. Over 100 lives were lost. This is one of Hawaii's most significant historic districts. We lost historic churches, schools, cultural centers, museums, libraries, archives, many, many homes and businesses. There have been many things that we've been able to accomplish over the last year, from connecting with all of the stakeholders. We did create 3 fire salvage webinars that were organized by the American Institute for Conservation, our parent organization for the National Heritage Responders. There were over a dozen of us that contributed to those 3 webinars in the fall of 2023. Part of this because we weren't able to get over there. It was an incredibly long and protracted reentry into Lāhainā. In fact, a year later, there are sites that still are inaccessible. We have been able to conduct outreach trips and meet with people and provide advice and connect them to resources. This is a picture of Lāhainā Public Library before and after. It was built in the 1950s. It had circulating collections and was a really beloved site with strong connections to community and lots of events. It's right on the waterfront. The one thing that they lost that is unrecoverable besides the building is vertical files of local history. Lāhainā Restoration Foundation had multiple sites in Lāhainā, including this Baldwin home, which was an early missionary site in Hawaii. Lāhainā Restoration Foundation's been around more than 50 years, and they've been restoring and rebuilding ever since their first founding, and they have an incredible staff. And they have multiple projects going to recover materials from these sites, and they will rebuild. This is the building after it's been shored up, after all the wooden members of the buildings burned. Windows and doors were beginning to collapse, so it's shored up here. This is another one of their sites. This is the Old Lāhainā Courthouse and Heritage Museum. The picture in the top left shows what was on the second floor before the fires. The main floor was a visitor center, and there was a basement. The basement hosted the Lāhainā Art Society. It was also a vibrant arts district. Lahaina's history goes back to pre-contact. It was a place of Hawaiian chiefs and chiefesses, and one of the first sites of the kingdom. It has all these layers of history, including missionary history, whaling history, the sugar that came in, and later with the tourism and arts district. This is a picture of Holy Innocents Episcopal Church safe. It's the only significant historic documents that we know made it through the fires. This fire safe fell face down, which accounts for the fact that it wasn't fully incinerated. These were charred on the spines, but the contents are recoverable. They're importantly because they are genealogical records. These are sacramental records going back to 1873. You can see here my colleague Leanne Na'awau, who's our library's paper conservator and fellow National Heritage Responder, doing an initial assessment with the diocese archivist, Stuart Ching. This was on New Year's Eve. And at left, you can see some of these. This is the earliest register from 1873. It had been rehoused in a post binder in plastic sleeves, and that was to protect the brittle pages. But now the conservation treatment will include removing those brittle pages from these melted and distorted plastic sleeves. Stuart has obtained National Endowment for the Humanities grant to do this work, and the registers are now in the possession of a paper conservator out of state, getting recovered. This is Keomoku Kapu at Keopuolani's gravesite. This is at Waiʻola Church Cemetery. Waiʻola Church had just celebrated its 200th anniversary before the fires, and that is a very old church in Hawaii's history. Na'aikani o Maui Cultural Center was a site that shared the pre-contact history of Lāhainā, the Hawaiian history of Lāhainā, and Keomoku Kapu and his wife Uilani were the founders of that. They will rebuild, but for now, he's one of the cultural monitors that is overseeing the site work to clear debris, and they will rebuild their site. Lāhainā Jodo Mission is one of the sites that we've been most actively working to assist. This is their pagoda, which is their columbarium, and you also see the giant Buddha at the back left of each image. The Buddha is largely unscathed. It needs to be cleaned and coated. The pagoda will be evacuated of all the urns, and they will be clearing the site. So that site will be rebuilt, and this is one of the properties that we are working actively to help recover. So we are, in this picture, beginning a project to remove the urns and other artifacts from the pagoda structure and move them into storage containers on the property. There were some shipping containers donated. And we are doing cleaning. There's a lot of fire scale and ash on the urns and some of the bronze bells that were recovered. We're doing a full physical inventory, a light cleaning of the surface, and yes, creating spreadsheets to be able to track the location of these and store them in archival boxes. So there are a lot of lessons learned. One thing that still holds true is relationships and the networks that we have remain crucial to our success. And the planning and training that we had helped with the timing and safety. It was months and months before anybody could get into Lāhainā, and everybody wanted to just fly over and volunteer to help right away. But the last thing they needed was more people to feed and house. So figuring out what we could do remotely was really important, and also keeping ourselves and other volunteers safe. Lāhainā Restoration Foundation had created backups of their important documents, their archival collections during the pandemic. And even though they've lost most of those paper documents, they're able to use that for their restoration and be able to continue to share those stories. So their work inspires us all. And finally, we are continuing to seek ways to advocate for the impacted sites in Lāhainā and contributing where we can. There are way too many individuals to thank that have worked with us this past year, and so I've just listed them out here as organizations, government, nonprofit, and all of our recovery partners. Here's my contact information. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Leah, thank you. I must admit, every time I hear about that disaster, I find it totally overwhelming to even know where you would start. So thank you very much for sharing that. Our second speaker is Hiroshi Kawamura, Vice President of the Assistive Technology Development Organization of Japan and a member of the Digital Accessible Information System Consortium, DAISY. He will talk about the role of libraries in inclusive disaster risk reduction and groundbreaking work into the needs of persons with psychosocial disabilities in preparing for their tsunami evacuation manual. Hiroshi.
Thank you, Linda. So please start my video.
Hello, my name is Hiroshi Kawamura, Standing Committee member of the IFLA LPD, Vice President of Assistive Technology Development Organization, Board member of the DAISY Consortium. The Great Kanto earthquake hit Tokyo area on 1st of September 1923. We lost 105,000 lives. The University of Tokyo Library, the oldest and the largest library in the country, was lost. After the disasters, the government set out the resilience standards. Every year on 1st September, the central and all local governments conduct disaster risk reduction activities to commemorate the disaster. The library was reconstructed in 1928, helped by global supports. The library holds more than 10 million titles now. The presenter studied geology at the Faculty of Science of the University of Tokyo and served the University of Tokyo Library as a librarian for 27 years. This presentation shares the view of the presenter who contributed as a global focal point of persons with disabilities at 2 United Nations conferences. Milestones of disability inclusion at the University of Tokyo Library is as follows. The University of Tokyo Library has been serving students with disabilities since 1977. Hosted an exhibition of new assistive technologies for Japan Library Association in 1981 at the UN Year of Persons with Disabilities. Installed a Braille computer terminal as early as in 1984. And the library gave strong support to the IFLA section of Libraries for the Blind, SLB in short, which resulted in the creation of the DAISY, Digital Accessible Information System, in 1997. And the library has the honor to serve two United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities committee members who are blind and deaf, respectively. The DAISY Consortium was founded by members of IFLA SLB in 1996 to develop an international digital talking book standard to guarantee global resource sharing for persons with print disabilities in the digital age. The presenter left the University of Tokyo Library to contribute to the DAISY Consortium. World Summit on the Information Society, in short, WSIS, held in 2003 and 2005, which was the conference to tackle the digital divide. DAISY Consortium and IFLA participated WSIS actively. The presenter, on behalf of the DAISY Consortium, took the responsibility of the global focal point of Disability Caucus of WSIS and facilitated participation of persons with disabilities in WSIS. Disability Caucus contributed to include universal design for everybody, including persons with disabilities, in the outcome document. DAISY Consortium and the World Wide Web Consortium jointly developed a research team on SMILE, Synchronized Multimedia Integration Language, which conducted an on-site research in Urakawa town in Japan to identify specific requirements of persons with psychosocial disabilities to prepare for their tsunami evacuation manual in May 2005. Disaster preparedness development was one of the main topics of the Global Forum on Disability in WSIS. Accessible tsunami evacuation manual in DAISY multimedia format, which is the outcome of the document accessibility research conducted by the joint research team of the DAISY Consortium and the W3C. The manual helped persons with psychosocial disabilities in Urakawa town to understand risks of tsunami and helped them to conduct regular tsunami evacuation drills 4 times per year, including severely cold winter evening since 2005. The town library of Urakawa disseminated the tsunami information collected and developed for the manual development to library patrons. The town library of Urakawa disseminated the tsunami information collected and developed for the manual development to library patrons. On March 11, 2011, 60 battered house members started evacuation immediately after the quake. Their evacuation triggered the quick evacuation residents in the tsunami hit zone. The good practice in Urakawa town proves that persons with severe psychosocial disabilities may contribute to the community resilience as the first evacuee when they understand the risk and how to evacuate. By provision of accessible and easy to understand evacuation manual. At the Third World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, representatives of Urakawa town, including persons with psychosocial disabilities, were invited to present the good practice by them at the panel session on proactive participation of persons with disabilities in disaster risk reduction. As a result of active participation of persons with disabilities in the Third World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, the following text was included in the paragraph 36 of the conference outcome document, which is known as the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030. I quote, "Persons with disabilities and their organizations are critical in the assessment of disaster risk and in designing and implementing plans tailored to specific requirements, taking into consideration inter area, the principles of universal design," end quote. In conclusion, libraries may collect and disseminate knowledge learned from disasters in many ways. Even if a library lost its collection and facilities by a disaster, lessons learned from the disaster and narratives of survivors could be added to the asset of the library reconstructed. Reflection on the disaster situation may enable libraries to develop its capacity to enhance the resilience of the whole community, which they are serving for in collaboration with library patrons. There are patrons who might be disproportionately hit by disasters, such as persons with diverse of disabilities and those living with foreign languages, and so on. Inclusive library services does not stop at the entrance of libraries, but reach out to the whole community to share knowledge learned from disasters, to mobilize the resilience and leave no one behind. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hiroshi, thank you so much. And actually, there's a lot of thought-provoking ideas that I learned out of your discussion that I will be taking back and thinking about in my work. So thank you so much. Our final speaker is Alison Stevenson, Director of Collections, Access and Research at the National Library of Scotland. She was Head of Library, Archives and Collections at the Glasgow School of Art when a major fire broke out in 2014, destroying the iconic Mackintosh Library. She will talk about the immediate disaster response and the salvage, collections conservation, rebuilding, engagement and media management that followed. Alison.
Hello, my name is Alison Stevenson and I am Director of Collections, Access and Research at the National Library of Scotland. In May 2014, when this photo was taken, I was Head of Library, Archives and Collections at the Glasgow School of Art. The Art School is a higher education institution in Scotland, offering undergraduate and postgraduate degrees in architecture, fine art and design. The school's housed in a number of buildings, the most famous of which was designed by this man, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, and built in phases between 1896 and 1909. The Mackintosh building became one of the city's iconic landmarks, of international fame for its beauty and as a pioneer of the British Art Nouveau style. Here's one of Mackintosh's original drawings of the building, and behind the triple height windows shown here was the library. The library was the most highly decorative and finely made part of the brilliant building. Architectural commentators have described the school as a building of many moods, using everything from exposed concrete to stained glass, and the library as a vertical galleried space with light filtering through layers of dark timber structure. Mackintosh designed everything in it, from the magazine table to the painted balustrades to the metal lanterns arranged in chandelier fashion. It was a work of art, and it was also a working library. For many decades, this was the only library for the students and staff of the art school. In the 1970s, both the book collections and the demand for more study spaces outgrew the space, and since then, the team of librarians operated services across the Mackintosh Library and a larger modern facility, which included everything you might expect from group study spaces to computing facilities and the majority of the printed collections. So that's where we were in May 2014 when fire broke out, and I'm now going to show a short clip from a film made by the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service.
And staff ensured all persons in the immediate area evacuate from the basement, with a large number exiting from the fire exit onto Scott Street and the main entrance onto Renfrew Street. A major contributory factor for the fire spreading throughout the building was from the obsolete ventilation system running throughout the building. A plant room in the basement supplied warm air via internal brick-lined shafts and timber ductwork, running horizontally to studios, offices and corridors throughout the building. This heating and ventilating system is no longer in use, but there are voids running the entire height of the building which can carry pipes and cabling. In Studio 19, the wall around the display area was constructed of timber panels, Canadian redwood pine, which formed the outer covering of a service void. An area slightly to the left of the projector had the panels removed, allowing access to the void where sprinkler pipes had been run previously. This void ran the entire height of the building to roof level. This timber-lined void acted like a chimney and allowed flames, hot gases and smoke to travel vertically. As flames and hot gases reached ceiling level of Studio 19, they then broke through into Studio 31 on the ground floor, directly above Studio 19. At least 4 voids run vertically throughout Studio 31, and these allowed unchecked fire spread to areas above and on the same level. The fire then spread vertically either side of the doorway and also horizontally in a westerly direction along voids in Studio 31. One of these voids allowed lateral access to Studio 32 at ceiling level. And from the Studio 32, fire then spread through voids into the Mackintosh Library above. The library's construction, layout and high fire loading, which included timber furniture, panelling and books, meant the room contents became totally involved in fire.
It was very clear early on Friday evening that the Mackintosh Library and its contents had been destroyed, and there was nothing that we could safely do to rescue anything from it, either while the fire was burning or on the days immediately following. It was also clear that there would be no business as usual at the art school for at least a week. That might not necessarily be the case with a fire in a bigger institution or even with the art school at a different time, but the fire happened on the Friday before a bank holiday, towards the end of a term when teaching on most undergraduate courses had already ended. The Mackintosh building was home to a diverse range of departments, including Human Resources, Student Registry and School of Fine Art, as well as the Library and Archives. So, in combination, these facts meant there was no question of trying to carry on as normal for the first few days. There's no expectation that the main library would be open for the 3 days following the fire, and a basic service could be provided in the following week. All this meant that the entire library and archive team who were in Glasgow that weekend, about 19 people, were able to focus all energy on working to decant surviving archival collections from sub-basement stores and caring for damaged collections brought out. When I look back at the weeks immediately after the fire, it is the people I remember. I can't say enough good things about the people I got to work with at that point. Not just the team members from the library and the archive, but also the rest of the staff of the Glasgow School of Art, teams from national bodies like Historic Scotland, and volunteers from the Glasgow Area Disaster Planning Network. Everyone was working extremely hard. Long days, in many cases doing physically demanding carrying work in wet, dirty conditions, and all while dealing with the awful emotional blow of such terrible damage to the Macintosh building that was really loved by those who knew it. So looking after the people was a priority. Just making basic things happen, like enough steel-toe cap boots to fit everyone. There were not enough for smaller feet in the first few days, and people resorted to stuffing the toes with newspaper. Making sure people got fed. The estates team regularly took the van and cleared out the nearest supermarket of all sandwiches, crisps and bottled drinks. Making sure people took a day off, and making sure people knew that their efforts were needed and valued. As well as looking after people, it was critical to empower people. The American author Atul Gawande wrote that under conditions of complexity, where the knowledge required exceeds that of any individual and unpredictability reigns, efforts to dictate every step from the centre will fail. People need room to act and adapt. Yet they cannot succeed as isolated individuals either. That's anarchy. Instead, they require a seemingly contradictory mix of freedom and expectation. Expectation to coordinate, for example, and also to measure progress towards a common goal. That describes our situation exactly. It was an extremely complex situation. We often didn't know exactly what was happening with regards to access to the building, and the threat constantly hanging over us was that the fire service would cede responsibility for the building to the council, who would then immediately stop access, potentially leaving collections to moulder in sub-basement stores, now very, very damp. There was so much to do: decant collections, make decisions about how to care for collections already brought out, hire dehumidifiers, buy the supplies the volunteer conservation team needed, meet with the insurers, and respond to offers of help coming in from all around the world. I had to say to people, you will need to make decisions above your usual role responsibilities. Use the best information you have, do the best you can, I trust you. And they did do magnificently. Archives and collections assistants pulled together a team of very senior academics and had them start to unload the planned chest drawers containing works of art on paper. Library assistants took responsibility for carefully removing sodden packing from ceramic collections and creating a list of any damage that needed to be seen by conservators. Another library assistant acquired the many rolls of netting and tinfoil needed to repackage textiles. Given the room to act and adapt, these people responded magnificently. We prioritised good internal communication with daily email updates to the team and morning and lunchtime review sessions. We did, of course, have documents to support us in our response to the disaster, including decent disaster recovery plans. But I think there were other documents which were as significant. Firstly, the catalogue. We knew exactly what we had in the Macintosh library. All of the books were catalogued, meaning we could rapidly provide the information that the executive team were looking for, that the marketing team needed for press releases, and the insurers were immediately asking for. In terms of insurance, the document in the middle of the image, the Preservation Assessment Survey, had been completed by volunteers under the supervision of our academic liaison librarians in July 2013. That led directly to us adding specific volumes from the library to the specialist art insurance held by the school. With regard to the Macintosh library, this is what we were faced with. We convened an extraordinary working group to take a strategic approach to the disaster. The group met fortnightly and considered issues like long-term storage, relocation of services, insurance, costs, communication, and business continuity. It provided an invaluable way of keeping everyone up to date with developments. We wrote a long-term plan just after the disaster, which might seem like folly, but it gave us a sense of being in control, which was good for our emotions. It would have been easy to give way to feelings of powerlessness in the face of the disaster and get overwhelmed with the scale of what we were facing. It gave us a structure to make decisions. One of those decisions was to employ a specialist archaeological service company to effectively dig through the meters of burnt wood and paper. They undertook a systematic excavation of the remains of the Macintosh Library, excavating down in columns at 25 centimetre increments. Each layer photographed and recorded, any salvaged artefacts recorded using established methodologies before removal for treatment or freezing. Some materials survive better than others depending on where they were in the room, the amount of oxygen available to the fire, whether they were tightly or loosely packed on the shelves, and whether debris fell on top of them from above. Again, this was emotionally very draining work for the librarians involved. We lost a significant proportion of the school's foundation collections. But we did have some miraculous survivors, such as this 19th century photographic volume of topographical views of Japan, complete in its original silk covers. Two more things to briefly mention. Our disaster plans didn't touch on social media, but the immediate aftermath of the fire, we were particularly struck by the importance and pressures of these communication channels. It was important to designate somebody who could deal with the offers of support, guidance from others, and questions from the public via Instagram, Facebook, and other social media your institution might employ. For us in 2014, this was Twitter. Through social media, we received significant offers of donations to the library. We were keen to capitalise on the goodwill, recognising it provided an opportunity for us to begin to rebuild the lost collections quickly. We published a wants list of about 700 titles on the website and publicised it widely. It was successful, and we were able to replace around 30% of the collections lost. Which is a positive thing to talk about, and looking at this slide here, it did feel for many years that we were stepping forward, making progress. We were dealing with insurance, we were repairing the collections, we were redesigning and rebuilding the Macintosh Library, and in fact the building works completed, the furniture was reinstalled, new collections acquired and catalogued, and we were scheduled to move in and reopen the Macintosh Library. And then, 16th of June 2018, the second fire. The second fire was almost unbelievable. We can only be glad that no one was physically injured. No cause has been determined, and the project to rebuild has been beset with difficulties. Although I moved to the National Library in 2019, I continue to hope that one day we will have a replica of the Macintosh Library back being used by students. Thank you.
Alison, thank you. And yeah, I remember both fires, what I call it, national grieving that happened after both of them. And I think that's actually something that we quite often forget in our disaster planning is emotions. And I was actually feeling them watching each of those presentations. And I think the research that was done in Arakawa has a lot to teach us about how information and training can help in disciplining us to act as leaders in those situations. I'm wondering, from each of your experiences, how we can better prepare ourselves and our teams to be able to manage and channel what quite often are very raw emotions in those situations, of senses of loss and devastation, and actually turn them into positive action. I wonder if anybody's got any thoughts about that.
Hi, Linda. Can I maybe come in?
Yeah.
I think it's quite hard to plan for that emotion. You know, I think until you've been through an event like that, which isn't necessarily a physical disaster, you know, I think colleagues at the British Library will have been feeling similar things as a result of the cyber attack. Just the sort of sense of loss, devastation, and the scale of the work needing to rebuild. So I suppose it's events like this, it's bringing together managers to share experience, to just, to make sure that consideration of emotional well-being is absolutely part of any disaster planning.
And I was just wondering how your teams coped, especially because of this really protracted lead-in into actually even getting into the sites, and the total devastation. I mean, the fact that all that was left was the documents in one safe. I wonder how the teams cope with that.
Yeah, I think there are so many different responses depending on your connection and distance from the space. I'm just reflecting on Hurricane Sandy in New York City that happened right after I joined the National Heritage Responders. And they created a large deployment team. And what they found was they needed people to listen to the survivors' stories before they could even begin to help with the recoveries. So then the American Institute for Conservation did training the next year in disasters and mental health, because it's such a big part of it for the people that are responding and trying to help, but also for those impacted by the disaster. And the closer you are, if it happens at your own institution, it's even more traumatic. There's no, just recognizing that people need to talk and be heard before they can begin to recover. And we're reminded of that constantly as we're reaching out to people from all these different sites, because we've compiled a list of all the impacted libraries, archives, schools, churches, temples, and have been sharing out information on grants and how to connect with recovery. And people lost their jobs and their homes and family members and friends, and they're not, even if they could get into their sites to recover any small things, that wasn't the starting place for most people. The exception was Lāhainā Restoration Foundation, because they had the largest staff with disaster training. So that training does come into play, and it really helped us to remind ourselves that there's other work that can be done while the initial search and rescue is happening. And then we just had to make ourselves available and find out who needed our help and how we could help.
Yeah, I think it's an aspect of disaster preparedness that actually has been overlooked for quite a long time, and that actually we probably need to think about. But I was also struck, Hiroshi, that the way that the preparedness in Urakawa basically enabled the group of people there to actually act as leaders in that situation. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how that preparedness was done. Was it simply through repeated drills, or was there more that happened there?
Thank you, Linda. So I think, first of all, when a disaster hits, survivors are the most important asset to rebuild the society and library and everything. And the stories they learned from the disaster experience is the best asset to analyze and to prepare for the next disasters. And the instance to conduct the research on the accessible contents, in particular for persons with severe disabilities, are based on the experience of our big disasters in Japan. Those disasters always showed the disproportional impacts on the community members. And in order to increase survivors, we have to focus on those disproportionately impacted high-risk persons. And when we conduct a good practice for their survival, the entire community could be safer. So that was the findings of our research when we conducted the Urakawa town research jointly by the DAISY Consortium and the World Wide Web Consortium and one of the research institutions in Japan. The outcome is already proved to be effective. And I think the easy to understand and accessible contents may increase the community resilience, in particular through the resilience development of people with those high-risk populations. So I think libraries and librarians have their own experience of disasters everywhere. That will be one of the other assets, so that the library has a strong motivation to be one of the focal points for the disaster risk mitigation and reduction. So that's my experience.
Yeah, and I heard about experiences in New Zealand when earthquakes struck, and it was similar, that actually libraries became the focal point of information dissemination. So I think it's a really important thing that we need to start thinking about. Thank you. Ben, have we got any questions coming in from our audience?
The chat has had a number of expressions of sympathy and empathy in relation to the disasters and the response that were described. No specific questions. I had one quick question, which was prompted by Malia's reference to the importance of relationships and networks in dealing with the aftermath of major disasters. And I wonder whether our speakers have any reflections on the really valuable networks or partners that your libraries have found to be invaluable in that recovery process, and who you looked to or who stepped forwards in terms of assisting with recovering from those really tragic incidents.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Our library actually had a massive flood that wiped out the ground floor in 2004. And so our former preservation head led that recovery, and that's how I joined the library later, doing flood recovery work long after that disaster had happened. Because she continued doing training statewide and across the Pacific and building these networks, we ended up connecting with our state civil defense and then went for additional training and built inventory of all of the libraries, archives, and museums. And we have a listserv because we're spread across 6 different islands here. And so we've repurposed this listserv from a grant and share out information when we know a storm is coming, a massive storm, or immediately in response, we can share out recovery tips for fire or water damage. And so having that network in place was really crucial, because then we could reach out to civil defense and to the federal government here and share out direct information on their behalf. And it's difficult because people retire. And so it's not something you can set it and forget it. It's something you really have to work at maintaining. So thank you.
We have a question from the chat, if I may, from Philip Kent from the University of Sydney, who asks, do our speakers have any observations on the benefits of digitization before a disaster hits? So again, I think all three speakers are probably qualified to speak to this, and I wonder if there are any thoughts on that question.
I might comment if I can. It's certainly critical in terms of the building, the rebuilding, that the Glasgow School of Art entire building had been LiDAR scanned and captured in digital photography in so many different ways, because it actually gave us the information needed to, you know, inform the rebuilding. In terms of digitization of collections, the art school hadn't done a lot of that, but when we were looking to rebuild the collections, we made maximum use of everybody else's digitization. So we were able to look and see which other libraries had digitized copies of items that were in our foundation collections, and therefore made the call to say that we therefore wouldn't prioritize seeking to obtain a new physical copy of that because it would be accessible online.
I think digitization is one of the most critical part of the business continuation program. So every institution, including libraries, should have a business continuation program to prepare for the disasters. And digitization is a core of that for libraries.
Yeah, and I'll also add for the work in Lāhainā, one of the great success stories was the silver lining of the pandemic was the federal government had given money for payroll protection. And that organization had several staff members with over a dozen historic properties they were managing. And they were able to keep some of their staff employed through that funds, and they chose to digitize their institutional records and historic documents. And so they actually have access to tell some of those stories that are important to the sites as they rebuild. And also the fact that several of the buildings were listed properties in a historic district. There were historic American Building Survey records for some of those, and blueprints, anything that had been saved so that they can rebuild. Another thing that was really interesting with social media was because these were many public sites and museums, public properties that people would visit, that social media, people posting pictures of the sites and the contents of the museums, they were able to figure out where to focus their recovery efforts, because we thought initially that sites were going to want to do an archaeological excavation of the sites, as Alison shared, but that there wasn't time because they needed to bulldoze properties. And so this targeted, like they knew that these display cases were in this corner, they would go and they would look for the metal and ceramic objects. So that turned out to be a really interesting, you know, targeted approach to recovery. So documentation of all types has been really important.
I was going to ask a question. Struck me that actually delays or threats to lose access to sites actually were quite a big factor in the initial response. I was just wondering where you faced that threat, how you coped with it, or if you couldn't actually get into the sites. I don't actually know how you deal with that, where you can't actually get into the site to actually do anything. I'd be really interested to hear a bit more about that.
I think at the Glasgow School of Art, we had access from quite early on, but the real concern was that that access would disappear. Is that we were able to get in, to bring materials out, to decant them into another building with the support of the fire service. But when the fire service were going to leave the building and hand it over to council, we expected to lose. And I think the tricky thing there was managing the uncertainty. You know, there was a huge amount going on. Obviously, the library team was just one of many parts of the library trying to, you know, of the organization, trying to find this out. And it was just, I suppose, how do we manage it? Doing what we could at the time, continuing to advocate to the executive team at the time as to why we felt like it was important that we continue to have access for a certain amount of time, what the benefits were in terms of being able to get collections out and start drying them out. But all through the process, all through the, you know, initial few weeks, there was a lot of uncertainty, and that, you know, inevitably adds to everybody's anxiety around it.
Yeah, I can just add for Maui, you know, none of our properties were in there. We were trying to help the different sites, but it was really frustrating because nobody could get into Lāhainā while the search and rescue is being done. And there was a lot of concern over toxicity in the air and soil and water. And so the Army Corps of Engineers was gonna have, well, the different federal entities decided that it was best to spray this soil tack on, which sort of encapsulates everything. But we were advocating strongly at those meetings that the historic properties with artifacts should be protected from that, because it was just going to exacerbate any kind of artifact recovery, having this material applied to it. But then also there was only going to be this very narrow window from when property owners were allowed to return to their site and then accept the government funded clearing of the properties. And so they had to wait, and then run in and get their stuff, because otherwise it's all going to be bulldozed. Or if you don't accept that government support, then you're left to fund the demolition work yourself.
Wow, what a dilemma.
It's been a process.
Wow. Yeah, it's on a different scale to what we'd expect. Sorry, Hiroshi.
I believe that the simulation and drill may improve the situation. So without that, the plan is just a plan, and no evaluation is conducted. So when you conduct the drill, a lot of problems will be found, and those are required to be improved.
Absolutely. I think we're nearly out of time, so I would just like to thank everybody who has contributed and the audience for joining us. So Malia, Hiroshi, Alison, Ben for co-hosting, and our amazing technical team who have ironically only just come back from a typhoon warning in order to actually get us on screen. So thank you very much for that. And before we go, I'd like to give a plug for the IFLA Information Future Summit, which is happening between the 30th of September and the 3rd of October. Registrations close on the 27th of September. And to access that, just either Google IFLA Information Future Summit or go to 2024.ifla.org. So thank you, everybody. I think that was a really interesting session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very much.